The day Margaret Merritt walked into the land office in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, she had exactly $4.32 in her dress pocket, a worn leather satchel over her shoulder, and the kind of determination that only comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. She had buried her husband, Thomas Merritt, 6 months prior, on a cold October morning when the frost had come early and the ground had resisted the shovel like it did not want to receive him. Pneumonia had taken him in under 2 weeks, quick and merciless, leaving Margaret with a mortgaged farmstead outside of Wichita, 2 horses she had to sell to cover debts, and a silence so profound it felt like a living thing in the house with her. She was 31 years old and she felt ancient. The creditors came in November. By December, the farmstead was no longer hers. She had packed what she could into a single trunk and a leather satchel: her mother's quilt, Thomas's pocket watch which she could not bring herself to sell, 2 dresses, a journal, and a Bible. And she had ridden the stage west and then south until she landed in Caldwell, a town sitting right at the edge of the Cherokee Strip, buzzing with the kind of energy that comes when land means survival and survival means everything. She had heard rumors, as widows often do when they are listening carefully and people assume they are not. She had heard about the abandoned parcels, land that had been claimed, worked briefly, and then let go for reasons the territory did not always record carefully. She had heard that the Homestead Act of 1862 still had teeth if you knew where to bite. The land office clerk was a thin man named Aldous Prout who wore spectacles so thick they magnified his eyes into something unsettling. He looked at Margaret across the worn oak counter with the expression men in positions of minor authority often wear when a woman walks in alone and presents herself as a person with business to conduct. "I am looking to file a claim," Margaret said. She set her satchel on the counter between them like a declaration. "You a widow?" Prout asked, not unkindly but with the efficiency of a man who had learned to categorize quickly. "I am," she said. "Got any relations?" "Brother, father, male kin who might be filing on your behalf." Margaret held his gaze steadily. "I am filing on my own behalf, Mr. Prout. I am 31 years of age, a citizen, and I have read the Homestead Act. I am entitled to file." Prout adjusted his spectacles. There was a pause that felt longer than it was. Then he reached under the counter and pulled out a ledger book the size of a small door. "There is one parcel," he said, turning pages with practiced fingers, "that has been sitting unclaimed for going on 2 years. Previous filer abandoned the claim, never built on it, never cultivated it. The land reverts. 160 acres south of the Cimarron River backing up against a limestone ridge. Good water access, but it is raw land. Nobody has wanted it." "Why not?" Margaret asked. Prout looked at her over his spectacles. "It is remote. No neighbors close by. There was talk about the previous claimant, fellow named McCrae, but he cleared out after a hard season and nobody has seen him around official business in some time. The land just sat." Margaret asked for the paperwork. She paid the filing fee, $14, which she had borrowed from a woman named Clara Hutchins at the boarding house, promising repayment within 6 months, and she walked out of that land office with a document in her hand that said, in the language of the United States government, that the 160 acres south of the Cimarron River now had her name upon it, and that she had 5 years to prove up on it. She allowed herself exactly 10 minutes of sitting on the bench outside the land office, looking at the dusty street with its wagon traffic and its hawkers and its smell of horses and prairie wind. Then she stood up, put the document carefully into her satchel beside Thomas's pocket watch, and began the work of figuring out how to get to a piece of land she had never seen. She hired a wagon driver named Pete Fowler, who was old enough to know better than to give her trouble and practical enough to understand she was paying for a service and not conversation. He drove her south from Caldwell for the better part of 2 days, the prairie opening up around them like something breathing, the sky so enormous it made Margaret's chest ache with the beauty and the loneliness of it simultaneously. They crossed into the grasslands proper on the second afternoon, the Cimarron River running low but clear in the spring light, and Pete Fowler pointed southwest and told her the limestone ridge she was looking for was another 3 miles. He left her at the edge of what she determined, by counting paces and matching them against the survey description on her claim document, was her land. Her land. She stood in the middle of 160 acres of Kansas prairie and felt the wind move through the grass around her and thought about Thomas. And then she stopped thinking about Thomas because she could not afford to write now, and she started looking at what she had. The previous claimant had left more than she expected. There was a dugout, a sod house built into the side of a gentle slope near a natural spring that was crude but structurally sound. The door had come off its upper hinge and swung at an angle, and inside the single room there was a rusted stove, a broken chair, and a sleeping platform built from rough lumber. But the walls were thick and had survived 2 winters, and the roof had not caved in. A person could live in it while building something better. There was also the frame of what had clearly been intended as a proper cabin, 2 walls of rough-cut limestone blocks standing about shoulder height on a flat piece of ground 30 yards from the spring, before the project had apparently been abandoned. Somebody had meant to build something real here. Somebody had started and then stopped. Margaret walked through the grass to the unfinished walls. She ran her hand along the top of the limestone. It was good, solid work, careful work. Someone had cut these stones with intention. She set up her camp in the dugout that first night, eating dried biscuits and drinking cold spring water and listening to the Kansas night, which was enormous and full of sound: coyotes, the wind, the clicking of insects, and once, something larger moving through the grass that she decided to believe was a deer. She had a rifle, an 1873 Winchester that had been Thomas's and that she could shoot with reasonable accuracy. She kept it beside her sleeping platform, and she slept, eventually, with the particular exhausted depth of someone who has been moving so hard and fast away from grief that their body finally simply surrenders to rest. She was up before dawn. Margaret Merritt was a woman who had grown up on a Missouri farm before marrying Thomas and moving to Kansas, and she understood, at a cellular level, that land did not wait. She spent the first week taking stock with ruthless practicality. She cataloged every resource. The spring produced good, clear water. The prairie grass was thick and healthy, which spoke to the quality of the soil underneath. The limestone ridge at the back of the property meant building material was available without hauling it from town. The unfinished cabin walls told her someone had figured the same thing. She began clearing around the spring first, because water was the source of everything. Then she turned her attention to the cabin walls. She would need help, eventually, with the heavier stone work, but she could do preparatory work on her own, clearing debris, sorting usable stones from crumbled ones, mapping out where the rest of the walls needed to go. She had been on the land 9 days when she heard a horse. She was at the spring, drawing up water in the morning light, when she heard the distinctive sound of a single rider approaching from the south at an easy pace, not a gallop, not a rush, the kind of approach that suggested someone who knew the land and was not concerned about what he would find on it. She dried her hands on her skirt, reached back and rested her hand on the Winchester that leaned against the rock, and waited. The rider came over the low rise and pulled up when he saw her. He was somewhere in his middle 30s, she guessed, though the sun and the outdoor life made exact ages unreliable in this country. He was broad through the shoulders, wearing a faded canvas coat and a dark hat with the brim shaped by long use. He had dark brown hair that needed cutting, a jaw that needed shaving, and eyes that were a very particular shade of gray-green that caught the morning light, and held it in a way that Margaret noticed with the involuntary clarity of an artist noticing color. His horse was a big roan, and both horse and rider had the settled, unhurried look of 2 beings who had been together long enough to understand each other completely. He looked at her, she looked at him, then he looked at the dugout, at her supplies, at the Winchester, and back at her. "You are camping here," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am living here," Margaret said. "This is my land. I filed a claim on it 9 days ago." Something moved across his face. It was not anger, not quite. It was something more complicated, the way a person looks when they see something they have been thinking about for a long time suddenly made real in a way they were not entirely prepared for. "This land," he said slowly, "belonged to a prior claim." "Which was abandoned," Margaret said. 2 years of non-improvement, non-habitation. The claim reverted. I filed properly, paid the fee, have the documentation. My name is Margaret Merritt, and this is my homestead." He was quiet for a moment. The roan shifted its weight, and he steadied it with a slight movement of his knee that Margaret noticed because it was the kind of unconscious competence that speaks to genuine horsemanship. "My name is Reuben McCrae," he said. Margaret went very still. She knew that name. Aldous Prute had said it in the land office. The previous claimant, the man who had abandoned the claim. "You are the one who left," she said. "I'm the one who had to go," he said, and the distinction in his voice was so careful and so weighted that she found herself paying close attention to it despite every instinct telling her to keep this simple. "There is a difference." "Be that as it may," Margaret said, "the land is legally mine now. I have the documents. If you have a dispute, the place to raise it is at the land office in Caldwell with Mr. Prute." Reuben McCrae looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the unfinished cabin walls, visible from where they stood, then back at her. "Those walls," he said, "I cut every one of those stones." "I know," Margaret said. "They are good work." Another silence. The morning was brightening around them, the dew on the grass catching light, a meadowlark somewhere behind her singing with an urgency that seemed disproportionate to the stillness of everything else. "I am not here to contest the claim," Reuben said at last. "I do not have the grounds to, and I understand the law well enough to know it. I came back because—" He paused, and she saw him choosing his words with a precision that seemed characteristic of him. "I came back because I had unfinished business with this land. I did not expect to find someone already on it." "And now that you have found someone?" Margaret asked. He looked at her directly then, and there was something in that look that was neither threatening nor calculating, but was instead quietly, carefully honest in a way that surprised her. "Now I find myself wondering if the unfinished business just got more interesting," he said. Margaret did not smile, but she felt something shift fractionally inside her chest, the way ice shifts in early spring when it has not yet broken but the structure of it is beginning to change. "Do you need water for your horse?" she asked instead. He did. She let him water the roan at the spring, and they talked careful, practical talk, the kind that two strangers on the frontier used to take each other's measure without revealing too much too quickly. She learned that he had left the claim in the autumn of 1880 because his mother had been dying in Abilene, and he had stayed with her through her death, and then through the settling of affairs that were more complicated than he had expected. And then the winter had been severe enough that returning to unfinished homestead work had not been possible. And by the spring of 1881 he had found work on a cattle drive north, and the time had slipped away from him the way time does when a person is grieving and working, and trying to rebuild a sense of direction. "You could have filed an extension," Margaret said. "I did not know I needed to until it was too late to matter," he said simply. She learned that he was 34 years old, that he had been born in Tennessee and come west with his father as a boy, that he had been a ranch hand and a cattle driver, and had done some scouting, and that he had filed on this particular piece of land because the limestone ridge and the spring had reminded him of something from his childhood that he could not quite articulate, but that he had recognized as right. He learned because she told him plainly that she was a widow, that her husband had been gone 6 months, that she had been left with nothing, and had used the little she could borrow to start again from the beginning, and that she had no intention of failing. When the roan had drunk its fill and the sun had climbed to a more businesslike angle, Reuben McCrae looked at the unfinished cabin walls again. "Those need another 3 courses of stone on the east and west walls," he said, "and then the roof framing. It is a bigger job than one person can do alone." "I am aware," Margaret said. "I could help," he said. "I would not be asking for anything in return except—" He paused again. "I would ask to camp on the property while the work is going on. I have supplies. I would not be a burden." Margaret studied him. She was a practical woman, and she was also a careful one, and she had learned that the frontier had a way of presenting both genuine offers and disguised threats in the same simple language. But she had been watching Reuben McCrae for the better part of an hour now, watching the way he handled his horse, and the way he looked at the land with something that was neither greed nor desperation but something quieter and more abiding, and she made a decision. "One condition," she said. "The work on this cabin is done according to my design. This is my homestead. Any decisions about what gets built and how get made by me." "Agreed," he said, without hesitation, and she believed him. He set up camp on the far side of the spring, at a respectful distance, and they began. The work was enormous and relentless, and in many ways it was exactly what Margaret needed, because it was the kind of work that fills every hour and exhausts every muscle and leaves the mind too occupied for grief to find a foothold. They were up with the light each morning and working until the light failed each evening, and in between they talked, the way people talk when they are doing physical labor side by side, which is differently than they talk when they are sitting still, more honestly, with less performance. Reuben was strong in the way that comes from a life of genuine physical work, not showy about it, efficient. He could read stone the way a good carpenter reads wood, knowing which piece would set true and which would need shaping. He had a knowledge of construction that was self-taught and practical and occasionally surprising in its ingenuity. Margaret found herself watching his hands sometimes when he was fitting a stone, the concentrated focus in his face, the way he would step back and look at a course of wall, the way a person looks at a sentence they have written and are deciding whether it says exactly what they meant. She brought her own competences to the work. She had grown up helping build and repair on a farm, and she had a good eye for level and plumb, and she was not afraid of heavy work. She could mortar as well as he could lay stone, and she quickly established that she would not be functioning as his assistant but as his equal. He seemed to appreciate this. She noticed that he never spoke to her the way some men spoke to women doing physical work, with a particular mixture of condescension and excessive encouragement, as if women were children who needed managing. He spoke to her like a person doing a job, noted when she had a better idea, accepted correction without resentment, and offered his own knowledge without arrogance. They took their meals separately at first, each cooking for themselves at their respective campfires. But by the end of the first week, this had shifted naturally into sharing the evening meal, because it was practical: one fire, one pot, less waste, and because neither of them had anywhere else to be. The evenings were when Margaret started to see dimensions of Reuben McCrae that the work did not reveal. He was a reader, which surprised her. He had 2 books in his saddlebags, a battered volume of Shakespeare's histories and a well-used copy of a novel by Dickens. And he read by firelight with an absorption that suggested he had been doing it for years. He was not a man who talked easily about himself, not because he was hiding things, but because he genuinely seemed more interested in the world around him than in his own story, which was an unusual quality, and one she found herself appreciating more each day. He asked her questions that were not intrusive but were genuinely curious. He asked about Missouri, about what it had been like growing up there before the war had changed everything. He asked about the farm she had lost, not in a way that picked at the wound, but in a way that said he understood that what she had built before mattered and deserved to be acknowledged. He was careful about Thomas, not avoiding the subject but not pressing on it either, letting her mention her husband in her own time and in her own measure. She talked about Thomas more easily than she had expected to. She told Reuben about how Thomas had been a kind man, genuinely kind, the sort of man who was better at wanting people to be happy than at understanding what would actually make them so, which had made their marriage both tender and sometimes quietly frustrating. She said this carefully, because she had not said it to anyone before, and Reuben listened without offering judgment of Thomas or excessive sympathy for her, which was exactly the right response. "He sounds like someone who meant well in every direction," Reuben said one evening, the fire burning down between them, the stars overhead doing what Kansas stars do, which is be so numerous and so bright that they feel personal. "He did," Margaret said. "He always meant well. I loved him for it." She paused. "I also sometimes wanted to shake him." Reuben smiled at that, and it was the first time she had seen him smile properly. Not the slight movement of his mouth she had seen before, but an actual smile that involved his eyes and changed his whole face and made him look younger and warmer, and like someone she was in danger of finding entirely too appealing. She looked away at the fire. They were 3 weeks into the work when Elias Drummond rode onto the property. Drummond was a big, red-faced man who ran cattle on the open range to the east and had been using the unclaimed land as informal grazing territory for his herd for the past 18 months. He came with 2 of his hands, all 3 of them mounted, and he pulled up his horse at the edge of the building site and looked at the cabin walls, which were now nearly complete, and then at Margaret and Reuben with an expression that was specifically crafted to communicate displeasure through entitlement. "I heard someone had filed on this parcel," Drummond said, looking at Reuben and not at Margaret. "I figured it was you, McCrae, coming back to cause trouble." "The claim belongs to Mrs. Merritt," Reuben said, and there was something in his voice that was very quiet and very clear in the way that genuinely dangerous things are sometimes quiet and clear. Drummond's gaze moved to Margaret with the particular brand of dismissal that some men have ready for women who present themselves as having rights. "Ma'am," he said, not kindly. "This is fine grazing land, and I have been running cattle over it by informal agreement with the previous occupant. Now I am going to need some arrangement about access." "There was no agreement," Reuben said. "I never made any agreement with you, Drummond. You grazed on unclaimed land because nobody was stopping you." Drummond's face went a shade redder. "Now see here, Mr. Drummond," Margaret said, and her voice was steady and clear, and she made sure it carried. "This land is filed and documented with the Territorial Land Office. Your cattle are welcome to water at the river, which is public access, but grazing on this property or crossing it without permission is trespassing on a legitimate homestead. I would be grateful if you would convey that to your hands and keep your herd to the east." Drummond stared at her. One of his hands shifted in his saddle. The other studied the middle distance with the expression of someone who would very much prefer not to be involved in whatever this was becoming. "You are going to need friends out here, Mrs. Merritt," Drummond said, and it was both threat and true statement simultaneously, which was the most dishonest kind of sentence. "I have found that to be the case everywhere," Margaret said, "and I have found that the best way to make friends is not to come onto people's property uninvited and make demands." "Good day, Mr. Drummond." There was a long moment. Then Drummond turned his horse and rode back east with his hands, and the property was quiet again except for the wind and the meadowlark. Reuben was quiet for a moment after they left. "He will make trouble," he said. "I expect so," Margaret said. "Most obstacles do." She picked up her trowel. "Let us finish this east wall before the light changes." He looked at her with an expression she had not yet fully catalogued, something between admiration and something warmer, and then he picked up a stone and set it in place. The cabin was completed in its basic form at the end of the 5th week. It was a single large room built of limestone, with a proper wooden floor that Reuben had hauled from the lumber yard in Caldwell in 2 trips, a cast iron stove that Margaret had purchased with the last of her borrowed money, and that Pete Fowler had freighted out at considerable effort, 2 windows with real glass. An extravagance that Margaret had decided was a necessity because she intended to be in this building through long winters, and she was not going to do it in darkness. And a door that hung true on its hinges and latched from the inside. The day they hung the door, Margaret stood inside the finished room and put her hand on the limestone wall, and thought about the fact that 6 months ago she had been standing over her husband's grave in frozen ground with $4 in her pocket. And now, she was standing in a house that was genuinely hers, on land that was genuinely hers, that she had built with her own hands, and the hands of a man she had not known 5 weeks ago. Reuben was outside, tending to some finishing work on the door frame, and he could not see her face, which was good, because she cried silently for a few minutes, not from sadness, or not only from sadness, but from the specific overwhelming emotion that comes when you realize that the thing you most needed to prove to yourself has been proven. She heard him come to the door. "Margaret." His voice was quiet. "Are you?" "I am perfectly well," she said, and her voice was only slightly thickened. "I am better than well, I was just—" She stopped. "I know," he said. He did not come in. He stayed at the door frame, respectful, and she was grateful for it. "It is a good house," she said. "It is," he agreed. And she heard in his voice something that might have been a different kind of emotion, something careful and deliberate, the voice of a man keeping something at a measured distance from himself. She understood that. She was doing the same thing. Reuben had been sleeping in a modest tent camp near the spring through the building period. Now that the cabin was complete, the natural logic of the situation was that he would move on. He had given no indication that he had permanent plans for the property, and she had not asked, because asking would require acknowledging something about the situation that she was not yet ready to name. On the day after the door was hung, he broke down his camp and loaded his gear onto the roan, and Margaret watched him do it from the cabin doorway with the particular stillness of a person who is deciding whether to say something. "Where will you go?" she asked when he brought the roan around. He stopped. He looked at her in that direct, honest, careful way of his. "I thought I might see if there is work on any of the ranches to the north," he said. "I have skills enough." "You do," she said. A pause. The roan blew through its nose. "There is something I want to say," Reuben said, and his voice was careful in the way it got when something mattered to him. "And I want to say it plainly because I think you deserve plain speaking." "All right," Margaret said. "I came back to this land because I missed it in a way I could not explain. I have worked a good deal of land in my life, and none of it ever pulled at me the way this piece did. I thought it was the land itself. The limestone ridge, the spring, the particular way the light falls in the late afternoon." He paused. "I believe now it was not just the land." Margaret was very quiet. I would not presume," he stopped, and she saw him collecting himself. "You lost your husband 6 months ago. You have built something extraordinary here from nothing, and you do not need anything from anyone. I understand that. I am saying this only because I believe in being honest with myself about what I am feeling, even when acting on it would be presumptuous or poorly timed." He looked at her steadily. "I will go north and find work," he said. "But if you ever had need of anything, anything at all, I would want to know about it." Margaret was quiet for a moment longer than felt comfortable, and she watched Reuben let the silence sit without filling it, which was another thing she had noticed about him. That patience of his, the ability to let a thing be what it was without rushing it. "The south field," she said finally, "needs to be broken and turned before planting season. It is more than I can do alone with the equipment I have." Reuben waited. "There is a room in this house," Margaret said carefully, "that is not being used, and a barn to be built, and a great deal of work between now and winter." She paused. "I am not in a position to pay wages, but I can offer board and partnership in the work," and she stopped. "And I am not unaware of what you just said to me." The silence between them was full of things neither of them had named yet, and for the moment that was exactly appropriate. "I will stay," Reuben said. He unpacked the roan. The weeks that followed were the fullest of Margaret's life, or at least they felt that way, not the way happiness feels when you are young and do not yet know what it costs, but the way it feels when you have paid for it and understand its value precisely because of what you traded for it. They broke the south field together, the work brutal and satisfying in equal measure, the turned earth rich and dark beneath the Kansas sky. They planted winter wheat in a kitchen garden. They built the barn, a proper one, with a hay loft, and as the summer deepened around them, The homestead began to look like what Margaret had seen in her mind when she had stood in that Caldwell Land office with her $4 and her determination. They were careful with each other. They were careful because both of them were intelligent people who understood that feelings, once fully acknowledged, create obligations, and obligations on the frontier are serious business. But the care had a particular quality. It was not cold care or watchful care, but warm, deliberate care, the kind two people exercise when they are protecting something they value. He brought her wildflowers once, in early summer, a casual bunch of prairie blooms he had found along the ridge while checking on a property line. He set them on the table inside without comment, and she put them in a tin cup with water and set them in the window where the afternoon light caught them. And neither of them mentioned it, but it changed something between them by a perceptible degree. She saved the last of the evening coffee for him habitually, knowing he took it without sugar, and that he would come back from the far pasture tired, and that a hot cup of coffee at the end of the day was a small thing that mattered in the way small things do when they are offered consistently. Clara Hutchins from the boarding house in Caldwell came out to visit in mid-July, which required some logistical maneuvering and a borrowed wagon, and she walked through the completed cabin with wide eyes and a hand pressed to her chest. "Margaret Merritt," Clara said, "you have built yourself something real." "We built it," Margaret said, and realized as she said it that the pronoun had shifted without her consciously deciding to shift it, and Clara looked at her with the sharp, kind perception of a woman who notices these things. "And the handsome man I saw coming out of the barn," Clara said, making her voice carefully neutral. "Reuben McCrae," Margaret said. "He is," she paused. "He is a partner in the work here." Clara made a sound that was not quite a word, but communicated an entire library's worth of observation. "A very good-looking partner," she said. "Clara, I am simply noting. Note something else." Clara smiled and noted nothing else aloud, but the look she gave Margaret as she left that afternoon was full of the specific warmth of a friend who sees something good beginning and is glad of it. The Drummond problem did not go away. In August, Margaret found her fence line on the eastern boundary cut in 3 places, and cattle had been through the break and trampled a section of her winter wheat. She documented the damage carefully, writing it down in her journal with dates and descriptions, and she rode to the county seat with Reuben to report it to the sheriff, a measured man named Caleb Price, who listened to her account with evident seriousness and told her he would speak to Drummond. Drummond denied it, of course, but the fence cutting stopped. Then, in September, Drummond filed a counter-challenge at the land office, claiming that Margaret's original filing had been improper because there was some question about the documentation of the prior claim's abandonment. It was a legal nuisance rather than a genuine threat, but it required a trip to Caldwell, a written response, and several weeks of uncertainty that Margaret absorbed with a steady jaw and a great deal of internally managed anxiety. Reuben was furious on her behalf in a quiet, contained way that she found both touching and faintly alarming. He sat at the table the evening after they received word of the challenge and went through the Homestead Act documentation with a focused precision that told her he had been reading it carefully. "He has no grounds," Reuben said. "The abandonment was properly recorded. Prout documented it himself. If Drummond wants to challenge it, he will need to show procedural error in the original filing, and there was none." "I know," Margaret said. "He is doing it to cost you money and time and worry. I know that too." Reuben set down the document and looked at her. "How are you?" It was such a direct, unguarded question that it caught her off balance. He asked it practically, but underneath the practical was the actual question, which was, how are you truly, right now, in the part of yourself that you do not show when you are being capable and steady and unafraid? "I am frightened," she said, and the honesty of it surprised even her, because she had not allowed herself to say it. "Not about losing the legal challenge. I am confident we will prevail, but I am frightened about what it means that someone like Drummond looks at me and sees something to be pushed over, and I am frightened that being right and being legally protected does not always mean being safe." Reuben nodded slowly. "Those are reasonable things to be frightened about," he said. "I know they are," she said. "That is what makes them frightening." They were quiet together for a while, the stove ticking with warmth, the autumn wind beginning to find its way around the corners of the limestone house. And in that quietness something settled between them, a kind of mutual admission that they were in this together, not as employer and employee or as neighbors or as any polite frontier category, but as two people who had chosen each other's company for reasons that were deeper than practicality. Later, when she was washing up the supper dishes and he was reading by the lamp, he looked up from his book and said, "I am not going anywhere, Margaret." She did not look up from the dishes. "I know," she said. She heard him turn a page. "Good," he said. The land office upheld her claim in October. Drummond's challenge was dismissed for lack of grounds, and Aldous Prout wrote a letter that was more direct than Margaret had expected from a man of his general timidity, stating that the McCrae claim had been properly documented as abandoned, and that the Merritt filing was valid in every particular, and that any further challenges without new substantive evidence would be regarded as vexatious litigation. Margaret read the letter twice and then set it down on the table and sat for a moment with her hands folded. Reuben was outside when she went to find him. He was repairing a section of the corral fence, his coat off despite the October chill, working with the efficient rhythm she had come to know as well as her own breathing. "We prevailed," she said. He set down his hammer. He looked at her. "Of course you did," he said, but his voice had that warmth in it that it got when something genuinely moved him. "We," she said. "I could not have done any of it without you." He came toward her, and she found herself very aware of the space between them, and then the closing of it. And then Reuben McCrae took her face in his hands, very gently, with the care of someone handling something irreplaceable, and looked at her for a moment with those gray-green eyes, and she felt the truth of the past 5 months settle around her like a blanket that had been there all along waiting for her to stop moving long enough to feel it. He kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss or a sudden one, but a deliberate, honest one. The kind that says, "I have known I was going to do this for a long time and I waited until it was right." She kissed him back. When they stepped apart, the October air was cold around them and the prairie grass was going golden with the season. And Margaret Merritt, who had come to this land with nothing but a claim document and $4 and a refusal to stop, felt something in her chest that she recognized slowly and with a kind of wonder as joy. Not the sharp, surprised joy of unexpected good fortune, but the deep, warm, settled joy of something that has been built carefully and is now revealing itself to have been worth every hour of the work. "I need to say something," Reuben said, his hands still gentle at her shoulders. "Say it," she said. "When I came back to this land and found you here, already building, already claiming it," he paused. "I think I understood something then that I did not have the language for yet. I told you I had abandoned it waiting for someone like you to find it. I said that as a joke because I did not know how else to say the true thing." "And the true thing," Margaret said, "is that this place was waiting," he said, "and you were the person it was waiting for. And when I found you here, it felt less like I had lost something and more like I had found the reason I came here in the first place." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked out at the homestead around them, the limestone cabin solid and true, the barn they had built together, the winter wheat coming up green in the south field, the spring catching light where it emerged from the earth, the limestone ridge red gold in the autumn sun. "I think," she said carefully, "that neither of us was finished yet when we started, and I think we are becoming something that we could not have been separately." Reuben McCrae looked at her with his whole face open, and it was such an unguarded expression on a face that she had come to associate with careful guardedness that it made her breath catch. "I love you, Margaret," he said. "I know it is soon. I know the correct thing is probably to wait longer and be more gradual about it, but I do not think I can be dishonest about it any more than I can be dishonest about anything else." She took a breath. "It is not too soon," she said quietly. "Not for what this has been." She reached up and touched his jaw with her fingertips. "I love you too, Reuben. I did not expect to, and I was afraid of it for a while, and I am not afraid of it now." He covered her hand with his and held it there. The winter came as Kansas winters do, with authority and without apology. But the limestone cabin held its heat, and the stove was adequate, and the barn kept the horses and the 2 milk cows and the half-dozen chickens safe from the worst of it. They moved through the winter months in the close, warm intimacy of 2 people who have chosen each other and are discovering daily how good that choice was. They read to each other in the evenings. Reuben read the Shakespeare to her with a dry, self-aware humor about the more theatrical passages, and she read to him from a volume of Tennyson that Clara Hutchins had sent as a Christmas gift, and they argued gently about which was better and were both right. He was a wonderful cook, which she had not expected and which delighted her. He had learned on cattle drives, where the ability to make something good from very little was a survival skill, and he applied the same creative pragmatism to the winter pantry that he applied to everything else. She learned that he had a laugh, a genuine one, not often deployed, but when it came, full and unguarded and transformative. She became mildly obsessed with finding the things that produced it. In January, after a long evening in which the wind had been savage against the windows and they had stayed close to the stove and talked for hours about everything and nothing, his childhood in Tennessee, her girlhood in Missouri, the particular ways the war had changed the country for people who had grown up just before it, Reuben said, quietly, during a comfortable silence, "Margaret, would you marry me?" She looked up from her sewing. He was looking at her with the steady, patient directness that was so essentially him. "Yes," she said. Not because she needed to, not because the frontier required it, not because she feared for her claim or her reputation, but because she wanted to, with a clear and certain want that had nothing afraid in it. "Yes," she said again, smiling now. "I will marry you, Reuben McCrae." He crossed the room and kissed her with a thoroughness that made the wind outside seem entirely irrelevant. They married in March of 1883, in Caldwell, in a small ceremony at the Presbyterian Church with Clara Hutchins as witness and Pete Fowler, the wagon driver, who had become a loose sort of friend, standing in the back row with his hat held against his chest. Aldous Prout from the land office was there, to Margaret's surprised amusement, apparently feeling some proprietary satisfaction in the match. Margaret wore her good dress, which she had altered to fit better, and Reuben wore a shirt that was new and a coat that had been brushed to within an inch of its life. She carried a bunch of early spring wildflowers that he had found along the limestone ridge the morning before, and brought to her with the same casual tenderness with which he always did such things. The minister read the words and they said them back, and when it was done, Margaret Merritt, who was now Margaret McCrae though she kept Merritt as she had before, felt the particular solemnity of an irreversible good thing, the kind of feeling that only comes when you understand what you are committing to and you are committing with your eyes fully open. Clara cried. Prout blew his nose vigorously. They drove back to the homestead in a borrowed wagon, and Reuben drove with one hand on the reins and one hand holding hers, and the Kansas spring was arriving around them in that spectacular, relentless way it has, and neither of them felt any need to say anything at all. The spring of 1883 was good to the Merritt McCrae homestead. The winter wheat had come through well, and when they harvested it in the early summer, the yield was better than Margaret's cautious estimate had allowed for. The kitchen garden was full, and the apple trees, 2 whip-thin saplings that Reuben had brought back from a trip north in March and planted near the house, were putting out their first tentative growth. They expanded the operation deliberately, the way experienced people do when they understand that growth that outpaces your ability to sustain it is not growth at all. They added a small herd of cattle, a modest number, purchased at reasonable prices from a rancher north of Caldwell who was reducing his operation. They built a second corral. They hired a young man named Jerome, 17 and hardworking, to help with the cattle through the summer. Elias Drummond had made himself scarce since the land office ruling. Margaret heard through Clara that he had other legal troubles, a dispute with a neighboring rancher about water rights, and had apparently decided that the Merritt homestead was no longer worth his attention. Margaret felt no need to seek him out and no obligation to forgive him for the fence cutting and the legal harassment, but she also felt no need to pursue further conflict. She filed the episode in the category of things that had been survived and noted and were now behind her. By the summer of 1883, she sat on the front step of the limestone house on an evening that was warm and golden and smelled of the prairie grass and the horses and the cooking fire, watching Reuben come in from the south field with his coat over his shoulder and the roan moving peacefully behind him. And she thought about the woman who had stood in the Caldwell land office with $4.32, and she felt toward that woman a complicated, tender pride. She put her hand on her abdomen, where she had been quietly aware of a change for about 3 weeks that she had not yet told Reuben about. She told him that night after supper, sitting at the table by lamplight with the Kansas summer making its sounds outside the open window. Reuben was very still for a moment. She watched his face, the way she had learned to watch it over the months she had known him, reading the careful sequence of his expressions. Then he looked at her, and his eyes were full of something enormous and unguarded, and he reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "Margaret," he said, and his voice was rougher than usual. "Are you well? Are you?" "I am very well," she said. "I am glad. I wanted to make sure before I said anything." He brought her hands to his mouth and held them there. She felt his exhale warm against her skin. "A child," he said. "In the winter, I think, late November or December." He looked up at her. His eyes were bright. "A child," he said again with the quality of a person still learning the shape of a word. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "I am." He stopped, swallowed. "I do not have an adequate word for what I am right now," he said, "but it is the best thing. It is the best thing, Margaret." She smiled, and she felt it all the way through herself, the smile warm and deep and thoroughly rooted. "Good," she said. "Then we are agreed." He came around the table and pulled her to her feet, and held her with a care that understood the precious weight of what she was carrying, and she rested her forehead against his shoulder, and let herself be held by the man she loved on the land she had claimed, and the life she had built from the particular raw material of absolutely nothing. Clara Hutchins came out to visit in August, and was told the news and promptly sat down, and cried so thoroughly that Margaret had to get her a glass of water. "You are the most determined woman I have ever known," Clara announced, when she had recovered herself, "and that baby is going to have the most extraordinary mother and the most quietly remarkable father, and I am going to be very involved, just so you both know." Reuben, who had taken to Clara with the patient warmth he extended to all people who were genuinely kind, said that this sounded entirely appropriate. The pregnancy was not easy through the late summer months. The heat was substantial, and the physical work of the homestead did not stop, though Reuben managed the labor distribution with a care that was neither patronizing nor negligent but simply attentive. He took on the heaviest of the field work himself and enlisted Jerome's help, and made sure that Margaret's tasks, while still real, were not punishing. She did not stop working. She would not have known how. But she worked differently, with more attention to rest, and she allowed Reuben to do the things that needed doing without arguing about it, which was its own kind of growth. In September, she received a letter from a woman named Ida Merritt, Thomas's younger sister, whom Margaret had not heard from since the funeral. Ida wrote from Independence, Missouri, to say that she had heard Margaret had filed on land in Kansas, and that she thought it was very brave and that she was sorry she had not written sooner, but that the grief had been hard on all of them, and that she hoped Margaret was finding some peace. Margaret wrote back. She told Ida about the homestead, about the limestone house and the south field and the winter wheat and the horses. She mentioned, carefully, that she had remarried and that she was expecting a child. She did not apologize for any of it. Ida's next letter came quickly and was warm and generous. She said that Thomas, of all people, would have wanted Margaret to live fully, and that she was glad of it. She asked about Reuben with the curious, eager tone of someone who has been lonely for good news. This correspondence became a regular thing, and it mattered to Margaret more than she had expected. The connection to the life before, kept alive in letters across the prairie distance. November arrived cold and serious, and in the last week of the month, on a night when the sky was so clear and so cold that the stars looked like ice, Margaret went into labor. Clara had been summoned the week before and was staying at the homestead, sleeping in the loft space that Reuben had finished out above the main room for exactly this purpose. She was not a midwife by training, but she had attended several births, and she was calm and capable, and exactly the right person for the room. Reuben spent most of the labor outside, doing things that needed doing and things that did not need doing, but that gave him somewhere to put his hands, because the inside of the house held something so enormous and so entirely beyond his ability to fix that the only place he could be useful was outside, keeping the stove stocked with wood and the water bucket full and the horses settled. At just after 4 in the morning, Clara opened the cabin door and called his name. He came in with snow on his hat and his face pale with cold and worry, and Clara stepped aside, and there was Margaret in the bed with a baby tucked against her arm, both of them red-faced and exhausted and entirely alive. And Reuben crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his child with an expression that Clara would later describe, to anyone who asked, as the most completely undone she had ever seen a man's face. "A boy," Margaret said. Her voice was tired and soft. "He is very emphatic about being here." Reuben reached out a hand and touched the baby's head with one finger, the gentlest possible touch, and the baby, unimpressed, being busy with the newborn business of breathing and existing, turned slightly and made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite not. "What shall we call him?" Reuben asked. Margaret had thought about this. "James," she said. "James Reuben McCrae." Reuben looked at her. She saw his jaw work, the controlled emotion of a man who feels things deeply and knows how to hold them. "That is a fine name," he said. "I thought so," she said. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, very carefully, and then sat with them both in the lamplight while the Kansas winter moved around the limestone walls, and Clara made coffee and pretended she was not crying again, and the homestead held them all in its solid, built-by-hand warmth. James Reuben McCrae was, as his mother had noted, emphatic about being here. He was a loud, determined baby who approached the world with the same no-nonsense assessment that characterized his mother and the same quiet stubbornness that characterized his father, and who grew, through the spring of 1884, into a round-cheeked, curious infant who regarded the prairie with wide gray-green eyes, his father's eyes, unmistakably, and seemed prepared to find all of it interesting. Reuben with the baby was something Margaret had not anticipated in quite the specific way it arrived. He was not awkward with James, had none of the careful distance that some men maintain from infants as though uncertain of the protocol. He held the baby with the same efficient, unhurried competence he brought to everything, and James, in turn, regarded him with an authority that seemed to recognize something familiar. She found them one morning in early spring, Reuben sitting on the front step in the first warm sunshine with James against his chest, talking to him in a quiet, steady voice about the condition of the south field and what they were going to plant there this season, and the baby was listening with the focused solemnity of someone taking notes. Margaret stood in the doorway and looked at this and felt something so deep and uncomplicated that she did not try to name it. She just held it for a moment the way you hold something that is exactly right. The homestead's second full year was marked by growth, steady and deliberate. They expanded the herd cautiously, added a proper root cellar, and Reuben built a small outbuilding that served as a workshop and storage, the limestone work as careful and true as the original cabin. Jerome stayed on through the year, joined in the summer by his younger brother Cal, and the operation took on the shape of something real and sustainable. Word of the homestead traveled, as things do on the frontier, where there is news in what people have built and how they have built it. A family named Greer settled 3 miles north, and they became neighbors in the genuine sense, people who could be called on, who would call on you, with whom to share the particular life of the prairie with all its extremes. Mrs. Greer was a sharp, funny woman named Rose who rode well and had opinions about everything, and who became, over the course of that second year, a friend to Margaret in a different but no less real way than Clara. Drummond made one final appearance in the spring of 1884. He rode up to the property line alone this time, no hands with him, and sat his horse and looked at what had been built, and then he looked at Margaret, who was standing in the yard with James on her hip, and Reuben, who was at the corral fence with his arms resting on the top rail, watching. There was a silence. Drummond's expression was unreadable, but it was not, this time, aggressive. He looked at the limestone house and the barn and the fields and the 2 corrals, and his face had the expression of a man who is completing a calculation and finding the result different from what he expected. "Good season," he said. "Very good," Margaret said. He nodded. Looked at James, who looked back at him with the frank assessment of an infant encountering something unknown. Another pause. "Your fence line is holding well," Drummond said. "It is," Reuben said. Drummond nodded again. He turned his horse. He rode east. He did not come back after that, and Margaret was willing to let the matter close there, without satisfaction or ongoing grievance, because she had found that the cleanest way to put a difficult thing behind you is to make the life you are building so substantial that the difficult thing runs out of room. The summer of 1884 was the best one yet. There was an evening in July when Margaret was at the limestone ridge with James, who at 7 months could sit well, and was expressing a deep interest in small rocks, which he collected with grave intentionality, and the sun was going down over the prairie in the extravagant way it does on clear summer evenings, painting everything in shades of orange and gold that seemed too beautiful to be entirely real. Reuben came up the slope from the south field and sat down in the grass beside her, stretching out his legs, and they watched James investigate a piece of limestone with the focused dedication of a geologist while the sky performed its evening spectacle. "Do you know what I have been thinking about?" Reuben said. "Tell me," Margaret said. "The day I rode back here and found you at the spring," he said. "The first morning you had your hand on that Winchester and you were looking at me like you had not decided yet whether to shoot me or negotiate." She laughed. "I had decided to negotiate. I had decided that before you even got close enough to be a target." "Had you?" He sounded amused. "You had a good horse," she said. "I have found that men who treat their horses well are generally worth negotiating with." He looked at her with that smile that changed his whole face. "That is a sound policy." "I thought so." James, having completed his assessment of the limestone fragment, turned and held it out to his father with an expression of grave significance. Reuben accepted it with matching gravity and examined it carefully and said, "Very good stone." "Good choice, James." James, satisfied, turned back to the ridge. Margaret leaned against Reuben's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the limestone ridge in the evening light on the land that had been abandoned and found and claimed and built and made into something real, and the prairie stretched away from them in every direction, enormous and beautiful and full of everything that was possible. "I told you," Reuben said quietly after a while. "Told me what?" Margaret said, though she had a sense of what was coming. "When I said I abandoned it waiting for someone like you to find it." He paused. "I said it as a half-joke because the truth of it felt too large to say plainly." "And now," Margaret said, "now I think it was just the truest thing I have ever said," he said simply. "I think I walked away from this land and this land waited and you came to it, and that is the shape of how things were supposed to be." He was quiet for a moment. "I think you were supposed to file that claim. I think the land was supposed to be yours first before it was ours." Margaret thought about this. About the woman she had been in the Caldwell land office, alone and frightened and refusing to show either, and the land she had walked onto with a survey document and a borrowed trunk, and the spring and the limestone walls and the door that had come off its hinge and the first winter night in the dugout listening to coyotes. "It was mine first," she said, "and then you came back and it became ours, and that is the right order." Reuben pressed a kiss to her temple, warm and unhurried. "That is the right order," he agreed. The year moved through the summer into autumn, and the autumn showed its colors in the prairie grasses and the cottonwoods along the Cimarron, and the harvest was excellent, and the root cellar filled to capacity, and Margaret updated the homestead ledger with the quiet satisfaction of a person watching a thing they have built become what they intended it to be. In the evenings they sat by the stove with the lamp lit, and James on the floor between them making determined explorations of his immediate world, and Reuben read and Margaret sewed, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they did not, and the silence between them was the good kind, the kind that only exists between people who have nothing left to prove to each other. Clara visited in October and stayed for 2 weeks, and the two women talked in the kitchen mornings while Clara held James and Margaret made bread, and Clara said, "You know, when you came to my boarding house with your satchel and that particular look in your eye, I thought you were either going to be the bravest person I had ever met or the most foolish." "And now?" Margaret asked. "Bravest," Clara said firmly, "by an extraordinary margin." In November, just before James's first birthday, Margaret realized she was pregnant again. She told Reuben on an afternoon when the first real snow of the season had come, and they were inside with the stove running well and James asleep in his cradle, and the house was warm and quiet and entirely itself. Reuben looked at her and then at the cradle and then back at her, and the expression on his face was the same enormous, undone thing it had been the first time, with perhaps an added quality of confident joy layered on top, the joy of a man who has done something once with wonder and is now doing it again with wonder plus knowledge plus gratitude. "Another," he said. "Another," Margaret confirmed. "James is going to have opinions about this," Reuben said. "James has opinions about everything," Margaret said. "He comes by it honestly." Reuben leaned across the table and kissed her, and she kissed him back, and outside the snow came down over the limestone house and the barn and the winter wheat and the spring and the limestone ridge, covering everything in the particular silence of snowfall, making the world quiet and new. By the spring of 1885, the homestead had been proved up on. Margaret filed the final paperwork with Aldous Prout in Caldwell, who shook her hand across the counter with a warmth that had developed over the 3 years of their acquaintance, and said, "Mrs. McCrae, I have filed a good many claims in my career, and I do not mind telling you that this one gives me particular satisfaction." "Thank you, Mr. Prout," she said. "You were very helpful at the beginning." "I was somewhat skeptical at the beginning," he said honestly, "and I was wrong to be." The deed came through in the summer, 160 acres with Margaret's name and Reuben's name both upon it, and Margaret held the document and thought about the $4.32 and the leather satchel and Thomas's pocket watch, which still sat on the shelf above the stove, because she had not stopped honoring what had come before, she had only added to it. The second baby was born in July of 1885, a girl this time, who arrived with considerably less drama than James had but with the same clear intention to be present and accounted for. They named her Clara Rose McCrae, for Clara Hutchins, and for Rose Greer, the two women who had held parts of the world together for Margaret during the years of building. Clara Hutchins, informed by letter, replied within the week with a letter that was substantially composed of the words, "Oh my goodness," repeated in various combinations, and with several blots that suggested she had been crying while writing, and concluded with a promise to visit at the earliest possible opportunity. James, at 18 months, regarded his sister with an interest that was cautious and then increasingly proprietary. He would sit near her cradle and watch her with a solemn attention that made Reuben say, one evening, that the boy was going to be either very protective or very bossy or very likely both. "He gets that from you," Margaret said. "The protective part, perhaps," Reuben said. "The bossy part is purely maternal." She threw a dish rag at him, and he caught it and grinned, and she thought, not for the first time, that the specific quality of being loved by this particular man was one of the finest things she had experienced in a life that had not always been fine and was now, solidly, resoundingly, unambiguously good. Jerome, who had stayed on through 4 seasons, announced that he was going to file his own homestead claim to the north, and Margaret helped him prepare the documents, and they wished him well and meant it genuinely. He sent word every few months for years afterward about the progress of his land, and Margaret always wrote back. The Greer family expanded as well, and the community that had been non-existent when Margaret first arrived began to take on the shape of something real, people who shared seed and labor and news and sorrow and celebration, who rode to each other's aid in the particular prairie emergencies of drought and illness, and the occasional genuine danger that the frontier still held in 1885, because it was still a country being made, and being made was not always a comfortable process. There was a drought scare in the summer of 1886 that tested every farm in the territory, the sky going brassy and the Cimarron dropping, and the grass burning brown along the ridges. Margaret watched the winter wheat with a vigilance that had its own particular tension, the kind of watching a person does when they understand exactly what is at stake. Reuben made adjustments to the irrigation from the spring that required considerable engineering ingenuity and a good deal of physical labor, and they managed to bring the crop through at reduced yield but not catastrophic loss. And the root cellar had enough in it from the previous year's abundance that they did not go hungry, and neither did the Greers, because Margaret had suggested they pool their surplus the previous autumn for exactly this kind of contingency. Rose Greer told her afterward that this had been the most practical advice she had received in her entire time on the frontier, and Margaret said that Thomas had always told her she overplanned for bad weather, and that she had decided after his death that Thomas had been wrong about that particular thing. She said it without bitterness and with a kind of rueful fondness, because she had arrived in the years since at a complete peace about Thomas and about what their marriage had been: real, imperfect, kind, and finished, and what her life had become after it, also real, differently imperfect, deeply kind, and very much ongoing. On a November evening in 1886, 4 years after Margaret had walked into the Caldwell Land office with her satchel and her determination, she sat at the table after supper with the ledger open before her, going through the accounts. Reuben was reading. James, now nearly 3, was asleep in the loft. Clara, 16 months, was asleep in the cradle near the stove. The wind outside was cold but distant, and the limestone walls held it at arm's length with their characteristic solidity. Margaret went through the numbers carefully. The land was paid for. The cattle herd was stable and productive. There was money in the bank in Caldwell, not a great deal, but enough to represent margin, which was everything on the frontier. The apple trees Reuben had planted were now 3 years old and had produced their first modest crop in the autumn, and the taste of them had been extraordinary in the specific way that things grown by your own hand on your own land always taste, like the fruit of something earned. She closed the ledger. Reuben looked up from his book. "Well," he said. "We are all right," she said. Not triumphant, not amazed, just the steady, confident statement of fact that comes from having counted everything carefully and found it good. He smiled. "We are better than all right." "We are," she agreed. She came around the table and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and he went back to his reading, and she listened to the particular night sounds of the homestead, the sleeping house, the wind, the horses settled in the barn, the occasional small sound from the cradle, and she thought about all the ways a life can go and the specific way hers had gone. The grief and the loss and the courage required and the love found and the thing built and the children sleeping and the man beside her, and she found the whole of it, every difficult part included, to be something she would not trade and could not regret. "Reuben," she said. He said, not looking up, "I want to tell you something." He looked up with the attention he always gave her when she used that particular tone. "I came to this land with nothing," she said. "I want you to know that I am aware of how much I have now. And I want you to know that of all of it, the land, the house, the children, all of it, the thing I am most grateful for is you." He was quiet for a moment. His arm tightened around her. "The first time I saw you," he said, "standing at that spring with your hand on that rifle and your chin up, I thought you were the most self-possessed person I had ever encountered." He paused. "I also thought you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. I did not say that because it seemed impertinent given the circumstances." "It would have been," Margaret said. "Very," he agreed. "But it was true." She tilted her face up and kissed him, and he kissed her back in the warm light of the lamp with the Kansas winter outside and the children sleeping and the limestone house holding steady around them. The years that followed were the years of becoming settled, which does not mean becoming static, but means something more like becoming rooted. The difference between something that sits on top of the ground and something that grows into it. The homestead put down roots in exactly this sense, growing in ways that were organic and responsive to the land and the weather and the family and the community around it. A third child came in 1888, a boy they named Thomas, because Margaret had decided that honoring what had come before was not a weight but a gift, and Reuben had agreed without hesitation. Thomas McCrae was a quieter child than either James or Clara, more watchful, with his father's habit of careful observation, and he grew into a boy who seemed to understand the land at a level that felt almost instinctive, following Reuben through the fields from the time he could walk with a gravity of attention that made Reuben quietly proud in the way he was always quietly proud of things, without display. James, growing into a sturdy, emphatic 5-year-old, and then a sturdy, emphatic 6-year-old, was the child who took most directly after Margaret in temperament, organized, determined, with strong opinions about the correct way to do things and a genuine warmth underneath the authority that made him, even at that age, someone people were glad to be around. Clara was the wild card, uncontainable, delighted by everything, afraid of nothing, who at 3 years old had tried to climb the barn roof, and at 4 had talked a coyote pup into the yard by sheer force of persuasive personality, an event that had required a good deal of parental intervention. The apple trees grew. There were 7 now. Reuben had expanded the small orchard, and by 1889 they produced enough fruit for eating and for the apple butter that Margaret put up in quantity each autumn, and that had become something of a local commodity, traded at the Caldwell market with the winter wheat and the surplus cattle. Clara Hutchins finally left the boarding house in Caldwell in 1889, when she married a widower named Harold Sims, who was a decent, steady man who clearly adored her. And Margaret went to the wedding and cried, which Clara said was deeply unfair given how much Clara had cried at Margaret's wedding, and how Margaret had teased her about it. "This is different," Margaret said, drying her eyes. "It is not different at all," Clara said. "You are my dearest friend," Margaret said. "I am allowed to cry." Clara hugged her hard. "You are my dearest friend too," she said. "And look at what we have both built." Margaret looked, and the view was good. The land office in Caldwell changed hands twice in the years following. Aldous Prout retired in 1890. And Margaret attended the small gathering his colleagues organized and brought him a jar of apple butter, and thanked him again for doing his job properly on a November morning in 1882, when a widow with nothing had come in and asked for a chance. Prout said that he was the one who should be thanking her. "Why?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious. "Because you reminded me of why the act exists," he said. "Not for the speculators or the railroads or the men with capital and connections, for someone like you, for a person who had nothing and needed a place to stand." Margaret held this thought carefully all the way home, sitting beside Reuben in the wagon with James and Clara and young Thomas in the wagon bed behind them, the Kansas landscape going brown and gold with autumn, the limestone ridge visible from the road as they turned south, the familiar silhouette of the house below it. She had a place to stand. She had built one. On a clear December evening in 1890, 8 years after Margaret Merritt had walked into the Caldwell land office, she stood at the kitchen window of the limestone house and looked out at the property in the last of the winter light. The south field lay fallow and frostwhite. The barn was solid and square. The corral held horses, including the roan's daughter Reuben had bred the roan carefully, and the line was good. The apple orchard was bare-limbed and beautiful in the cold air. The spring ran clear and faithful at the base of the slope, the same spring she had first drawn water from in the April of 1882, before she had known any of what would grow from that moment. James was 9 now and already helping with real work on the homestead, with the quiet capability his father had modeled for him. Clara was 7 and fully herself in every direction. Thomas was 2, and in the particular stage of locomotion and discovery that kept everyone attentive. And Margaret was 3 months into a 4th pregnancy, which she and Reuben had discussed with the measured, practical joy of people who knew both the beauty and the cost of bringing life into this country, and were glad to do it. She heard Reuben come in from the barn, the familiar sound of his boots, the creak of the door, the particular sequence of sounds that said he was back, he was here, everything was accounted for and well. He came to stand behind her at the window and put his hands on her shoulders and looked out at what they could see in the last light. "The south field needs turning early in the spring," he said. "I know," she said. "The east fence has a post going soft. I will replace it before the ground freezes hard." "Good." A pause, the comfortable, established pause of two people who have been in the same life for long enough to know how to be still together. "Do you ever think about it?" he said. "The way it started," she leaned back slightly against him. "You coming over the rise on the roan and finding me at the spring." "Yes, all the time," she said. "I think about the woman I was that morning, how frightened I was and how I did not show it." "I knew," he said. She turned to look at him. "Did you?" "You were very steady and very certain," he said, "and you had your hand on that Winchester and your chin at a particular angle that said you were not going to be moved. But your eyes told a different story. Not afraid of me," he paused. "Afraid of what would happen if this did not work. Afraid of what came next if one more thing failed." Margaret thought about this. The accuracy of it moved her. "That is exactly right," she said. "That is exactly what I was afraid of." "And now," he said, she looked at him. At the face she knew so completely, the gray-green eyes and the jaw and the expression that was always honest, always careful, always warm beneath the deliberateness. "Now I am not afraid of what comes next," she said. "Not because there is nothing to fear. The frontier has plenty of that. But because whatever comes, we are here together and this is the ground we built, and I know we can hold it." He kissed her forehead. His arms came around her from behind. Outside, the Kansas winter was closing in over the limestone ridge and the spring and the south field and the apple trees and the barn and all of it. Their land, their life. The thing built from nothing by a woman with $4.32 and a heart that refused to stop. "We can hold it," Reuben McCrae said. And they did. The 4th child was born in the summer of 1891. A girl they named Ida, after Thomas's sister, who had become through years of letters a genuine and cherished connection. Ida Merritt made the trip out from Missouri for the first time that autumn, a slight, nervous woman who stepped off the stage in Caldwell with wide eyes and a traveling trunk, and Margaret embraced her on the street like the family they had determined to be. Ida stood in the middle of the limestone house and turned around slowly and looked at everything, the good wooden floor, the real glass windows, the shelves lined with preserves and books, the children watching her with various levels of shyness, and she said, "Oh, Margaret." "I know," Margaret said. Thomas would have Ida stopped. "I know," Margaret said again, more gently. Ida stayed for 2 weeks, and she helped with the children and walked the orchard with Margaret and heard all the years of the story. And when she left, she held Margaret's hands on the station platform and said, "He would have been so proud of you." "I was proud of myself first," Margaret said, and it was entirely true. That is what he would have wanted. She waved Ida off on the stage and walked back to where Reuben was waiting with the wagon, young Thomas on his lap already asleep, James sitting seriously beside his father, Clara standing up in the wagon bed with her face into the wind despite instruction to sit. "Ready?" Reuben said. Margaret climbed up. "Let us go home," she said. He turned the wagon south. The limestone ridge caught the afternoon light the way it always did, red gold and reliable, the same as it had been on the first April morning when she had stood in the grass with her survey document and looked at what she had claimed. The spring ran at the base of the slope. The house stood solid and square. The apple trees were full of late summer fruit. The south field was gold with wheat. Margaret McCrae, who had come to this land with nothing, sat beside the man who had built it with her and looked at all of it and felt the full settled weight of a life that was exactly what it was supposed to be. She had filed the claim. She had done the work. She had loved honestly and been loved back. She had planted and harvested and built and repaired and lost and found and chosen again, every day the life she was living, and the land held all of it. The limestone house stood. The spring ran on.